I have been driving freight across the country for over 14 years, hauling everything from frozen poultry to industrial machine parts through every weather condition imaginable. When you spend that much time behind the wheel of a massive diesel engine, the highway stops being just a road and transforms into a separate reality with its own specific rules and rhythms. You learn to read the subtle changes in the vibration of the floorboards. You understand the exact moment your tires lose their grip on slick asphalt, and you become intimately familiar with the profound, heavy isolation that settles over the world after midnight. The late hours demand a certain level of respect because the darkness plays tricks on human perception, stretching shadows into strange shapes and turning the hypnotic rhythm of the passing white lines into a dangerous lullaby that tries to pull you into a deep, permanent sleep. I usually push through the fatigue by rolling the windows down to let the freezing air bite at my face and turning the radio up until the static rattles the speakers, but 3 nights ago the exhaustion felt entirely different. It was a heavy weight, pressing down on the base of my skull, blurring the edges of my vision and making the dashboard dials swim in and out of focus. I knew I was becoming a hazard to myself and anyone else who might be sharing the desolate stretch of interstate I was currently navigating. My headlights caught a faded, reflective blue sign announcing a rest area 1 mile ahead, offering a brief sanctuary from the endless momentum of the drive. The facility was incredibly remote, situated in the middle of a dense, sprawling forest that seemed to swallow the light from my high beams completely. There were no gas stations, no vending machines, and no overhead sodium lights illuminating the off-ramp. Just a narrow slip road winding into a dark clearing surrounded by towering, ancient pines. I guided the heavy truck down the ramp, the air brakes hissing violently in the quiet night as I brought the vehicle to a slow, shuddering halt in the empty parking area. The silence that followed the engine shutting down was immediate and oppressive, amplifying the sound of the wind moving through the unseen canopy above. I unbuckled my seatbelt, rolling my shoulders to work out the deep aches that always accumulate after a 12-hour shift, and looked down at my phone resting in the center console. The screen showed a battery level of 4%, so I plugged it into the dashboard charger, deciding to leave it behind while I stepped out to stretch my legs and use the facilities. I figured I would only be gone for a few minutes, entirely unaware of the catastrophic mistake I was making by leaving my only connection to the outside world resting on the passenger seat. The air outside the cab was damp and bitterly cold, carrying the heavy scent of rotting pine needles and wet earth. The parking lot was in a state of severe disrepair, the asphalt spider-webbed with deep cracks where aggressive weeds had pushed their way through the surface to reclaim the space. Across the clearing, sitting at the edge of the dense tree line, was a squat, rectangular building constructed from gray cinder blocks, serving as the only amenity for miles. A single fluorescent bulb flickered erratically above the heavy metal entrance door, casting long, twitching shadows across the cracked pavement as I walked toward the building. The heavy metal door protested with a loud, grinding squeal as I pulled it open, stepping into a space that smelled overwhelmingly of stagnant water, cheap industrial bleach, and years of accumulated grime. The interior was lit by exposed fluorescent tubes running along the ceiling, buzzing with an aggressive, electrical violence that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I walked over to the row of stained porcelain sinks, turning the rusted metal handle to splash freezing water onto my face, hoping the shock would clear the lingering fog of exhaustion from my brain. The mirror mounted above the sink was heavily scratched and covered in a layer of dull film, reflecting a distorted gray version of my own tired face back at me. I grabbed a handful of coarse brown paper towels from the dispenser, drying my hands and face before tossing the crumpled mass into a rusted metal trash can, overflowing with garbage. I turned toward the exit, ready to return to the warm cab of my truck and sleep for a few solid hours before the morning sun broke over the horizon. I placed both hands flat against the heavy metal exit door, leaning my weight into it to force the rusted hinges to move, and stepped forward, expecting the freezing night air to hit my face. Instead of stepping out into the cold, open parking lot, I found myself stepping directly into an identical indoor space. The air hitting my face was the same stagnant, damp mixture of bleach and grime I had just been breathing. I stood completely still, my hands dropping to my sides, trying to force my exhausted brain to process the visual information in front of me. I was standing in a concrete restroom block that perfectly mirrored the one I had just attempted to leave. The same row of stained porcelain sinks lined the wall to my left. The same rusted trash can sat overflowing with coarse brown paper towels, and the same aggressive, buzzing fluorescent tubes flickered violently overhead. I turned around, looking at the heavy metal door I had just pushed through, feeling a cold, irrational spike of panic blooming in my chest. I pushed the door open again, stepping backward, expecting to return to the original bathroom or the parking lot, but the door simply led right back into the exact same identical space. My initial thought was that my fatigue had finally triggered a massive hallucination, or that the architectural layout of this specific rest stop was designed in a confusing, mirrored loop to deter vandalism. I decided to simply walk forward, moving past the identical sinks and the identical stalls, aiming for the heavy metal exit door at the far end of this second room. I kept my breathing slow and measured, telling myself that the fresh air was just a few steps away, pushing the final door open with a forceful shove to finally escape the oppressive, buzzing concrete box. The door swung outward, and I stepped through, but my heavy boots did not land on the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The ground beneath my feet yielded with a soft, damp resistance, feeling less like soil and more like a dense, fibrous muscle tissue. I stumbled forward, struggling to keep my balance on the uneven terrain, my eyes desperately trying to adjust to an environment that defied every rational law of biology and physics. I was standing in a vast, sprawling forest, but the towering structures rising from the ground bore absolutely no resemblance to the ancient pines I had seen when I parked my truck. The trunks were smooth and wet, composed of a dark crimson material that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic heartbeat, weeping a thick, viscous sap that smelled strongly of raw copper and old blood. I reached out a trembling hand to steady myself against the nearest trunk, feeling the warm, yielding surface compress slightly under my palm, confirming the impossible reality that the vegetation surrounding me was constructed entirely from living, breathing, organic tissue. Looking upward, the horror of the landscape compounded, completely shattering my fragile grip on sanity. The canopies of these towering, meaty structures did not sprout leaves or branches, but instead exploded into massive, tangled clusters of humming fluorescent glass tubes, emitting a harsh, blinding white light that cast the entire forest in a sterile, hospital-like glare. The buzzing sound coming from thousands of these glowing canopies merged into a deafening, continuous drone that vibrated deep within the cavities of my chest, making it entirely impossible to think clearly. I tilted my head further back, shielding my eyes from the blinding fluorescent canopies, trying to find the night sky, hoping to see the familiar comfort of the moon or the stars. The sky above this nightmare forest was a vast, swirling whirlpool of dark, shifting colors, spinning relentlessly around a massive, empty void situated at the very center of the atmosphere. I squinted against the harsh light, trying to focus on the small, dark shapes that made up the swirling mass of the whirlpool, tracking their spiraling descent toward the central black hole. The shapes were distinct, possessing clear appendages and heads, tumbling over each other in a silent, agonizing ballet as they were sucked upward into the infinite darkness. The dark silhouettes forming the massive atmospheric vortex were undeniably, unmistakably human bodies, millions of them, twisting and flailing without making a single sound, forming the very fabric of the sky above me. A profound, violent nausea slammed into my stomach, dropping me to my knees on the damp, yielding ground. I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to block out the deafening buzz of the fluorescent canopies, squeezing my eyes shut to erase the image of the spiraling human shapes from my mind. I needed to wake up. I needed to be back in the cab of my truck, dealing with the simple, manageable problem of highway fatigue, rather than kneeling in a landscape constructed of meat, glass, and eternal suffering. A sharp metallic scraping sound cut through the continuous drone of the canopy, originating from the shadows between the pulsing crimson trunks. I opened my eyes, slowly lowering my hands, scanning the surreal undergrowth for the source of the noise. The movement was erratic and jerky, disturbing the damp, fleshy ground as multiple shapes began to emerge from the deeper sections of the forest. The creatures skittering toward me possessed the basic anatomical structure of massive arachnids, but their bodies were entirely synthetic, formed from a chaotic, horrifying amalgamation of garbage and structural debris. Their long, multi-jointed legs were constructed from jagged lengths of rusted steel rebar, scraping and clicking against each other with every stilted movement. The central bodies of these spiders were formed from large, jagged chunks of shattered porcelain, bearing the distinct curved edges of broken toilets and sinks, held together by thick, wrapping layers of filthy, dripping brown paper towels. The creatures moved with a terrifying, unified purpose, their rusted rebar legs piercing the meaty ground, leaving small, bubbling wounds in the terrain as they advanced. They did not have visible eyes or sensory organs, but they were tracking me with absolute precision, their porcelain bodies clattering against each other as they swarmed forward. I realized with a cold, sinking clarity that I was the only purely organic, foreign object in their immediate environment, and the scent of my sweat, my breath, and my fear was drawing them in like a beacon. The paralyzing shock broke, replaced entirely by raw survival instinct. I scrambled to my feet, my heavy boots sliding on the damp, bleeding ground, and turned away from the advancing swarm, launching myself into a dead sprint through the dense, pulsing forest. The air was incredibly thick, filling my lungs with the suffocating scent of copper and industrial bleach, making every breath a physical struggle. I dodged around the massive, fleshy trunks, the blinding glare from the fluorescent canopies disorienting my sense of direction, casting harsh, moving shadows that made the forest floor completely unpredictable. The rusted scraping of the rebar legs grew louder behind me, accompanied by the wet, slapping sound of the filthy paper towels dragging against the ground, confirming that the creatures were closing the distance with terrifying speed. I ran until my chest burned, leaping over protruding veins that snaked across the surface of the ground, risking quick glances over my shoulder to gauge the proximity of the swarm. The spiders were relentless, their jagged porcelain bodies navigating the obstacles of the forest without slowing down. I focused my attention forward, desperately searching the horizon for an end to the trees, hoping to find a clearing, a structure, or any change in the landscape that might offer a chance of escape. The forest stretched into infinity, a repeating, endless nightmare of pulsing red trunks and blinding white light, topped by the continuous silent suffering of the human whirlpool spinning in the sky above. The realization hit me with the force of a blow, draining the adrenaline from my system and replacing it with a profound, crushing despair. There was no end to this place. Running deeper into the forest would only exhaust my limited energy, ensuring that the rusted rebar legs would eventually overtake me, dragging me down into the damp, yielding ground to be disassembled by jagged porcelain. My only chance of survival, however slim, was to navigate back to the point of entry. I altered my trajectory, using the thickest, most massive fleshy trunks for cover, attempting to circle back toward the area where I had initially stumbled into this reality. I slid behind a particularly large, weeping pillar of muscle tissue, pressing my back flat against the warm, vibrating surface, holding my breath as the main body of the swarm skittered past my hiding spot. The clicking and scraping of the metal legs passed within inches of my position, the foul, damp odor of the rotting paper towels making my eyes water and my stomach heave, but I remained completely motionless until the sounds began to fade into the distance. I stepped out from behind the cover of the trunk, moving with careful, silent steps, retracing my path through the disorienting glare of the fluorescent canopy. Every shadow felt like a threat, every distant scrape of metal sending a jolt of panic through my nervous system. But I kept moving forward, desperate to find the familiar gray concrete of the rest stop door. The freestanding doorway appeared in the distance, a completely incongruous structure sitting alone in the middle of the fleshy landscape, attached to absolutely nothing, simply a metal frame holding a chipped, gray door. I abandoned all caution and sprinted the final 100 yards, ignoring the fresh wave of metallic scraping that erupted from the undergrowth as the creatures registered my sudden movement. I threw myself against the heavy metal door, grasping the rusted handle and pulling it outward with every ounce of remaining strength in my body. I tumbled backward into the stagnant, bleach-scented air of the identical bathroom, kicking the door shut just as the first rusted rebar leg stabbed through the opening. The heavy metal slammed against the steel frame with a deafening crash, severing the intruding metal limb, sending the jagged piece of rebar clattering across the tiled floor. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the heavy, overflowing trash can and dragging it across the wet tiles, wedging it firmly beneath the door handle to act as a makeshift barricade. The creatures immediately began assaulting the exterior of the door, their rebar legs scratching and gouging the metal surface with a horrific, high-pitched screeching that echoed endlessly against the concrete walls of the bathroom. I backed away from the door, my chest heaving, staring at the barricade, knowing that the thin metal frame and the rusted trash can would not hold the swarm back indefinitely. I spun around, scanning the featureless concrete walls of the bathroom, searching for any alternative exit, any structural weakness that could offer a way out of the sealed box. My eyes landed on a small, rectangular ventilation grate positioned high up on the wall near the ceiling, covered in a thick layer of gray dust and cobwebs. It was incredibly narrow, a tight, galvanized steel duct designed to circulate the damp air, but it was the only physical opening in the entire room that did not lead back to the nightmare forest. The screeching against the metal door grew more intense, accompanied by heavy, rhythmic thuds as the larger porcelain bodies began hurling themselves against the barricade, causing the rusted hinges to groan and buckle. I dragged one of the heavy porcelain trash receptacles over to the wall, climbing onto the unstable surface to reach the high ventilation grate. I wedged my fingers through the narrow metal slats, ignoring the sharp pain as the rusted edges sliced into my skin, and pulled backward with absolute desperation. The screws holding the grate to the concrete wall gave way with a sharp crack, sending the metal cover falling to the floor, exposing the dark, narrow opening of the duct. I grabbed the bottom edge of the opening, pulling my upper body into the claustrophobic space. The walls of the duct pressed tightly against my shoulders and chest, restricting my breathing to shallow, rapid gasps as I pushed myself deeper into the darkness. I heard the barricaded door below me finally buckled, the hinges snapping under the sustained pressure, allowing a chaotic flood of rusted rebar and broken porcelain to spill onto the bathroom floor. I pushed, sliding my body further into the pitch-black shaft, feeling the sharp, galvanized screws tearing through my heavy jacket and scraping against my skin. The crawl through the ventilation infrastructure was an exercise in pure, agonizing endurance. The metal duct offered absolutely no room to turn around, forcing me to continue pushing myself into the unknown, trusting that the shaft eventually led to the exterior of the building. The air inside the vent was thick with decades of accumulated dust, dead insects, and the sharp metallic tang of oxidized steel, coating the back of my throat and making me cough violently, which only caused my chest to expand and wedge tighter against the unyielding metal walls. I lost all concept of time in the darkness, my entire reality reducing to the repetitive, exhausting motion of pushing backward with my boots, sliding my shoulders against the scraping metal, and praying that the duct did not narrow any further. The panic of becoming permanently stuck, buried alive in the tight metal tube between impossible realities, threatened to overwhelm me completely, but the memory of the swirling human sky and the rusted arachnids provided the necessary terror to keep my legs pushing. I finally struck a solid barrier, halting my progress entirely, causing a fresh wave of claustrophobic panic to surge through my chest. I saw thin slivers of actual pale moonlight cutting through the darkness, filtering through the slats of an exterior ventilation cover. I braced my heavy boots against the walls of the duct for leverage and drove both of my fists outward, striking the metal grate with maximum force. The cover bent outward on the first impact, the rusted retaining screws screaming against the metal frame, and broke away completely on the second desperate shove, tumbling away into the night air. I dragged my upper body forward out of the narrow opening, losing my grip as my center of gravity tipped over the edge of the duct and plummeted toward the ground, landing heavily on my shoulder in a patch of wet, overgrown grass. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the sky, the freezing night air filling my lungs with the beautiful, grounding scent of wet soil and actual pine trees. There was no continuous deafening drone, there was no harsh fluorescent light, and most importantly, the sky was completely still, a deep, peaceful expanse of black velvet scattered with the familiar, indifferent points of starlight. I slowly pushed myself off the ground, my body aching from a dozen different scrapes and bruises, pulling debris and cobwebs from my hair and clothes. I recognized the surrounding environment immediately. I was standing in the tall, overgrown weeds directly behind the same gray cinder block building I had originally entered, just a short walk around the corner from the cracked asphalt of the empty parking lot. I staggered up the incline, walking on the cracked asphalt toward the parking lot, my eyes searching the darkness for the familiar shape of my rig, desperate to climb into the cab and lock the heavy doors behind me. The massive truck was parked exactly where I had left it, the dark shape dominating the empty clearing. But as I moved closer, a deep, unsettling confusion replaced the relief of finding my vehicle. The truck was covered in a heavy layer of accumulated dust, water spots, and pine needles, looking exactly like a vehicle that had been sitting untouched in the woods for several days. The windshield was smeared with a thick film of yellow pollen and bird droppings, and the heavy tires were ringed by wind-blown debris and dead leaves that had piled up against the rubber. I pulled my keys from my pocket with trembling fingers, inserting the key into the driver's side door, turning the lock mechanism with a sharp, familiar click. The heavy door opened, spilling a small collection of trapped pine needles onto the pavement, and I climbed into the stale, freezing air of the cab, immediately reaching for the dashboard where I had left my phone connected to the charger. The phone was sitting exactly where I had placed it, but the battery was completely dead, the screen a blank, dark rectangle. I turned the ignition key, praying that the massive diesel engine would respond, feeling a wave of immense relief wash over me as the starter motor ground heavily for a few seconds before the engine finally roared to life, shaking the accumulated dirt from the hood. The dashboard electronics flickered to life, the digital clock glowing brightly against the dark interior of the cab. I stared at the glowing green numbers, feeling the final, lingering shreds of my sanity quietly slipping away into the buzzing silence of the cab. I had pulled into the rest area at approximately 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, fully intending to wash my face and immediately return to the driver's seat. The digital display on the dashboard indicated that it was currently 4:15 a.m. on a Wednesday, not the following day. I checked the date on the navigation system, confirming the impossible reality that my brief excursion into the concrete bathroom, the fleshy forest, and the narrow ventilation duct had somehow cost me an entire week of linear time. I plugged my phone into the active charging port, waiting in stunned silence as the device slowly booted up, the screen eventually illuminating to reveal dozens of missed calls, frantic text messages from my dispatcher, and voicemails from family members demanding to know why my GPS tracker had been stationary in a remote forest for 8 days. I am sitting in the idling truck right now, the doors locked, the heater blasting, staring out through the dirty windshield at the squat, gray cinder block building sitting at the edge of the tree line. The single fluorescent bulb above the heavy metal door is still flickering violently, casting those same long, twitching shadows across the cracked pavement. I haven't responded to the dispatcher yet. I haven't listened to the voicemails. I am typing this out on my phone, trying to force the chaotic, impossible events into a structured narrative, hoping that putting the words onto a screen will somehow make the reality of the situation easier to process. I don't know what happened to me in that building. I don't know if I stumbled into a tear in the fabric of reality, if the crushing fatigue finally forced my brain into a week-long localized coma where I hallucinated the entire ordeal, or if the architecture of the highway hides trapdoors that lead to places designed to process human suffering. My knuckles are bleeding from prying the grate open. My heavy jacket is torn to shreds, covered in gray dust and oxidized metal flakes, and I can still smell the overwhelming scent of raw copper and industrial bleach clinging to my skin, a physical reminder that the damp, yielding ground was absolutely real. I am completely terrified to put the truck in gear and drive back onto the highway, because I don't know if the road I am currently parked next to is the actual interstate or just another elaborate, identical layer of the trap. I need someone to tell me they have experienced something similar. I need to know if it is safe to drive, or if I am still wandering through the endless, buzzing corridors, moving further away from the real world with every mile I cover. I am watching the heavy metal door of the restroom block, waiting for the rusted, jagged shapes of broken porcelain and rebar to push it open, stepping out onto the asphalt to finish the hunt.